Here's the rewritten script title. Princess Catherine stuns the world with revelation about Prince Louis's hidden healing path. So, Princess Catherine just broke with something the palace almost never does. And the reason behind it turned out to be far more heartfelt than most people anticipated. We're not talking about an official bulletin or a carefully worded statement that's been reviewed by a dozen different communications advisors. She sat alone, looked at the script her team had prepared, and essentially set it aside. She spoke in her own voice about Prince Louis and the quiet healing journey the family had been shielding from the world for months. And here's where things get really interesting. The palace had stayed quiet for so long that people started wondering why appearances were being reshuffled, why calendars kept changing, why the youngest prince had simply stopped showing up. No reason was ever offered. That silence was intentional. William had pushed for it from the start, convinced that keeping things private would shield Louis from gossip, headlines, and the relentless attention that trails royal children from the moment they're old enough to smile for a camera. Catherine understood that instinct completely, but over time she began to see that the silence was creating an entirely different problem. Louis had started to believe his condition was being kept secret because the family was embarrassed by it. That's the detail that reframes everything. So let's walk through what actually unfolded here, because the sequence of events tells quite a story once you lay it out properly. Prince Louis had been recovering from complications tied to a serious respiratory illness. At first, the family assumed it was a routine seasonal bug, the kind children pick up constantly, but it became clear fairly quickly that something more was going on. The fatigue wasn't lifting. He was leaving breakfast untouched and barely speaking. He pointed toward his chest and told William he was too worn out to eat. The real turning point, the moment Catherine would later describe as the one that changed everything, came during a private rehearsal at Windsor. It was meant to be a gentle reintroduction for Louis, a quiet practice run before a formal royal engagement, with no crowds, no cameras, and no pressure. Partway through the morning, Louis stopped, reached for his mother's hand, and whispered that he couldn't get enough air. Catherine dropped to his level immediately, wrapped both hands around his, and felt how cold his fingers were, despite the warmth of the room. William cleared everyone, except the medical staff, from the space. He personally made sure George and Charlotte were taken to another part of the residence, because he refused to let either of them watch their brother in distress. That moment reshaped everything within that household. Now here's where a tension began to emerge between what the family was showing the outside world and what was actually happening behind closed doors. William insisted that every commitment involving Louis be put on hold immediately. He believed missing one ceremony mattered far less than risking a setback in the boy's condition. That's hard to disagree with, but senior staff cautioned that repeated absences would invite questions. In royal terms, an engagement is an official duty or public appearance carried out on behalf of the monarchy, and when a prince simply stops appearing at them, people take notice. The advisors pushed for a controlled explanation before speculation could rush in to fill the quiet. William said no. He would not let his son's recovery become public conversation while the child was still frightened and uncertain. That instinct makes sense. But the silence didn't only protect Louis. It began affecting the other children in ways the parents hadn't quite anticipated. George, as the oldest, felt that steadiness was expected of him. He was quietly trying to carry strength for the whole family. But one evening he asked William whether a younger sibling could become seriously ill without people outside the family ever finding out. That wasn't a question about palace protocol. He was asking whether silence was a sign of danger. Charlotte, meanwhile, was picking up on every closed door and every hushed voice. She understood far more than anyone had told her. She started tucking handwritten jokes beside Louis's bed because she recognized that laughter, even briefly, brought back the version of her brother she knew. And when she overheard staff discussing the attention that followed the announcement, she went to find Catherine and asked whether strangers were now concerned about her brother. Then she asked whether Louis would have to respond to all of them. These are not questions any child should have to carry alone. Catherine was holding a different kind of weight entirely. She was reassuring Charlotte that healing can take time while concealing how little rest she herself had managed. She was holding back her deepest fears to protect William, and he was doing the same for her. Their bond held firm, but exhaustion was slowly turning tenderness into guarded distance. And at the heart of all of it was Louis, too young to fully grasp royal protocol, but old enough to read fear in the faces around him. He had always been the child who filled quiet rooms with energy, questions, and sudden laughter. As the youngest prince, he carried fewer immediate ceremonial expectations, but he was central to the family's sense of ordinary life, which is precisely why his sudden exhaustion felt so alarming. The tension between Catherine and William came to a head after she wrote her own version of the statement. She laid those handwritten pages in front of him after the children were asleep. The palace-approved draft sat alongside them, polished and measured. For context, a palace-approved statement is wording that's been cleared by royal advisors before release, generally designed to guard privacy and prevent misunderstanding. But to Catherine, those sentences felt hollow. They described a recovery without admitting fear. They acknowledged progress without capturing what the family had actually lived through. William read the opening line and immediately shook his head. He reminded her that any public message could be played back, dissected, and recalled long after Louis had moved past the illness. He asked whether she was ready to watch their son's recovery be analyzed by people who had never once been in the same room as him. His voice climbed, then went quiet. The sharpness came from fear, and they both understood that. Catherine didn't back down. She told him Louis had started to believe the secrecy existed because the family was ashamed of his condition. Then she pushed the official draft to one side and said the careful language contained no trace of the boy. They had merely watched lose faith in himself. She pointed out that George and Charlotte had learned to speak more quietly whenever Louis's health came up. Their eldest watched every closed door. Their daughter left jokes beside her brother's bed, because she understood that laughter had become part of his recovery. The silence was no longer protecting just one child. It was quietly shaping all three. And then she told William something that I think genuinely got through to him. Louis had made a request of his own. He wanted to thank the medical team who had made him feel safe. He wanted George and Charlotte to know how much their support had meant, and above all, he did not want people to assume he had vanished because he lacked the courage to keep going. William sat down. He covered his face for a moment and admitted that his choices had been driven not only by a desire for privacy, but by his own dread of losing control. That's a pretty significant admission from a future king who has spent his entire life being trained to hold steady. Together, they found a middle ground. Catherine could speak, but she would protect the medical specifics while acknowledging the weight of what the family had been through. But there was still one more voice that could halt the message. That brings us to King Charles. Charles received the draft after an evening briefing and cleared the room before he read it. He went through the pages twice. When he reached the line about a child mistaking privacy for shame, he took off his glasses and set them on the table. The words unsettled him because royal tradition so often teaches restraint before children are old enough to understand what it costs. Louis had been shielded from scrutiny, but that same shield had begun to make him feel invisible. William arrived shortly after, and Charles asked only one question. Did the statement genuinely serve Louis, or did it simply ease the anxiety the adults around him were carrying? William defended Catherine's judgment, but acknowledged that once the recording was out, the family would lose control of how the story moved. Reporters would look back at absences, examine decisions, and search for details the family had chosen not to share. Communications officials had prepared a more guarded version of the statement, but it stripped out Louis's wish to thank the people who had supported him. Charles set that version aside. A statement emptied of the child's own meaning, he decided, would protect the institution while letting down the person it was meant to serve. He gave his approval with one condition. Louis had to hear every word before the recording went out and understand precisely what the public was going to learn. Catherine read the final version to her son privately. Louis listened with unusual stillness, then corrected one line. He didn't want her to say he was simply doing better. He wanted people to know he was getting strong again. She changed it immediately. Charles approved the revised wording with a handwritten note that said truth delivered with care could protect the crown more honestly than silence ever could. So the recording went out. Catherine spoke steadily, thanked those who had looked after Louis, and confirmed that his strength was returning. The response was immediate and, honestly, quite striking. Phones began ringing, headlines appeared, and messages poured into the palace. But the tone of the coverage shifted quickly. Broadcasters started piecing together timelines from Louis's recent absences, placing older family photographs alongside Catherine's new statement. One commentator paused footage, taken before the illness, and began studying the boy's expression. William picked up the remote and turned off the television. He said his son's recovery would not become a form of entertainment, but something else was taking shape beyond the palace gates that I think says more about what this moment actually meant. Families began leaving handwritten blue stars outside Windsor Castle, carrying the same phrase Louis had chosen, "getting strong again." The stars spread along the public railings. Each one carried a message for Louis or for another child facing a hard road. Windsor Castle, one of the monarchy's principal residences, had witnessed celebrations, mourning, and national uncertainty. Now its gates held something quieter. Proof that one family's fear had touched thousands of others. A newspaper placed Catherine's composed expression on its front page beneath the words, "A mother's voice." A smaller line repeated Louis's phrase about becoming strong again. That headline mattered because it didn't frame him as fragile or broken. It framed recovery as something that required courage, and it placed a mother's honesty above palace spectacle. Some commentators still pressed for answers. They questioned why the palace had gone quiet and why earlier absences had never been addressed. Officials responded firmly that a child's health was not public property. The family had shared enough to honor the journey without handing over every private detail. And when one phrase from the recording, "the moment we feared recovery had changed direction," sparked intense speculation, advisors recommended a follow-up clarification before questions multiplied. Catherine declined. She said laying out every frightening detail would undo the privacy they had worked so hard to hold on to. The real turning point, though, the one that actually matters, didn't happen in a briefing room or on camera. It happened when William found Louis sitting quietly after the announcement, no longer surrounded by doctors or siblings or watchful adults. William walked into the family's private sitting room and found his son waiting in silence. He bypassed the chair nearby and settled on the floor instead, putting himself at the same level as the child. Then he asked one simple question. How did Louis feel now that people knew? Louis paused before answering. He said he had noticed that his father stopped talking about royal events whenever he entered the room. Hearing about engagements had once felt exciting to him. During his recovery, those conversations had simply disappeared. The boy had started to believe everyone assumed he would never be well enough to attend one again. William had removed every mention of duty to keep Louis from feeling any pressure, but that choice had made his son feel shut out from his own future. That's the thing about silence. You can't always predict what it tells people. Then Louis shared something his father had never known. During the hardest week, he had heard William crying just outside his bedroom door. The child had pretended to be asleep because he didn't know how to help. That confession broke through the composure the future king had been holding for months. William pulled his son close and told him that bravery didn't mean never feeling afraid. It meant speaking even when fear made staying quiet feel easier. Louis held on, then said what he wanted. He wanted to return gradually, not through a major occasion, but at a small family engagement where George and Charlotte could be right beside him. Catherine came in only after that conversation had ended. She saw William's face, looked at Louis, and understood that something important had shifted. Together the parents agreed there would be no statement, no staged appearance, and no expectations until their son decided he was ready. Louis made his first return at a small family gathering, connected to a children's community project. There was no advance notice, no formal address, and no requirement that he perform for anyone watching. A community project is an organized effort aimed at supporting local families or children, and this one allowed him to re-enter royal life without the weight of a major ceremony. He paused just before going in. Charlotte took one hand, George took the other. Catherine didn't urge him forward or try to hide his hesitation. She waited until her youngest son chose the moment himself. Then all three children crossed the threshold together. William watched them and finally understood that recovery didn't mean restoring the version of Louis that existed before the illness. It meant building a new sense of safety. He had once believed that privacy was measured by how much the family held back. Now he accepted that silence could protect a child physically while still leaving him emotionally alone. Catherine had arrived at the opposite understanding. Honesty could free Louis from shame, but it couldn't become a reason to expose every medical detail. She had spoken through a personal recorded statement because that format allowed her to acknowledge the truth while keeping the boundaries her son still needed in place. Charles later said, during a private family conversation, that the monarchy had not been diminished by what was shared. He believed it had gained something by facing difficulty without turning pain into performance. His words carried weight because the crown has long valued restraint, but this moment showed that dignity and emotional honesty could occupy the same space. When Louis finished the gathering and came back to his parents, he didn't ask whether he would be allowed to come again. He asked when he could return. That question was the final answer to everything. His recovery continued steadily, and the family placed his well-being, his confidence, and his childhood ahead of any ceremonial obligation. Catherine received a photograph of the blue stars left outside Windsor and pressed her fingers against one message written by another child. She quietly asked for the display to be preserved for Louis. William read a letter from a father who had also struggled to explain illness to his own children, and he recognized that their honesty had reached families far beyond Windsor. Louis chose one star to keep beside his bed. Its message was simple. "You were brave even when you were resting." The monarchy responded with restraint. There would be no campaign, no staged photographs, and no hurried return. Catherine's decision had never been defiance or a bid for attention. It was a mother correcting the story that fear had written, and giving her son permission to see himself as someone recovering rather than someone hiding. The family had spent months believing that love meant building walls around him. They came through it, understanding that protection also requires listening and honesty, and the willingness to admit that fear is not the same as weakness. The silence had done its work, and then compassion required it to end. Princess Catherine broke her silence so that Prince Louis would never confuse a private struggle with something to be ashamed of. And when Louis walked between George and Charlotte without being lifted or hurried or sheltered from view, the fear no longer had the final word. That chapter was behind them. Before we wrap up, if you want to stay current on royal family news as it unfolds, hit subscribe on Crown Watch so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.